We know that all of the entities who are involved when a patient has a delay or a gap in treatment are actively pursuing resolutions to get the patient back onto treatment. But we were curious as to who is most often designated to bring about the resolution. Who is most often designated with the most immediate next steps? What we found in the data was this, that the manufacturers most often have the most immediate next steps in these conversations, followed by the provider, followed by the patient in this situation. Now, this was kind of interesting because you may recall we said that manufacturers, patients, and providers are all involved in these conversations in roughly equal measure. And we know that the provider holds the key to unblocking the delay, but the manufacturer, most often in these conversations, have the next step. So again, we wanted to peel back the onion to better understand what were those next steps that the manufacturer had to help us understand how these delays were getting resolved. So again, we turned to our qualitative data. And when we did, we learned this, that more often than not, the manufacturer's next steps are to contact the provider, to move the provider and urge the provider along in accomplishing those tasks. In fact, 46% of the manufacturer's next steps are indeed to contact the provider. So, too, when the patient has next steps, most often those next steps are to contact the provider, to be that squeaky wheel. In fact, 53% of the patient's next steps were to contact the provider, urging the provider to then do the work to unlock the delay by submitting and correcting forms, by submitting or correcting prior authorizations and appeals, by submitting and correcting prescriptions, or submitting and correcting orders. In fact, when we think about that avalanche of administrative paperwork that must be done, the sheer volume that Olivia was sharing with us moments ago, is it any wonder with that volume that there are then errors that have to be corrected? And is it any wonder that this avalanche makes it virtually impossible for a provider to sustain a communication loop between the provider and the manufacturer and the patient? Is it any wonder that they are unable to sustain that communication loop, which then results in what we heard in these conversations, which were the manufacturers and the patients consistently saying, I haven't heard back from the doctor's office. And so the eddy goes. Our providers are buried in an administrative avalanche. The burden on our providers is evidenced by national surveys of physicians themselves, and it is evidenced in these organic conversations that are coming into our contact centers. They are buried in an administrative avalanche, and it impacts us all. We're left then with one final yet most important question, which is, what else can we be doing to decrease the administrative burden that our providers are facing? We ask the question as what else because we know that no matter what entity you may represent, you are taking steps to try to reduce this burden, and you have considered ideas. In fact, some of the ideas that we have heard people from a variety of healthcare verticals suggest are things like this: simplifying enrollment forms, building EMR integration to get into provider workflows, eliminating the need for forms altogether, re-envisioning the use of field representative teams, retiring the fax machine, making process statuses visible to patients, building patient trackers. All of these are practical ideas that we have heard people explore And we've also heard them explore big ideas that go across the industry. Ideas like centralizing requirements across healthcare to eliminate different requirements for each drug or formulary or in each country, changing legislation on prior authorization requirements, building universal forms, much like the college app for colleges. We know that the question of how else we can decrease the burden on our providers is a big and difficult question. But we ask you to consider, what are your ideas? In fact, we believe that we all must ask this question because we know from nature that a single voice can start an avalanche. So the challenge for all of us is to use our voices to start an avalanche of change.